The land wasn't just empty. It was hungry. It pressed out flat and blistered, stretching so far the horizon itself seemed to bend under the weight of the heat. For 2 days it had been trying to swallow Clara and her little girl, Ruth. For 2 days the sun had been a hammer, beating down on them, trying to pound them into the dust. But Clara wouldn't lie down. She was a mother, and that made her stubborn. Dust filled her throat. It coated her tongue. Every breath was like chewing on sand. She could feel the ghost of a tug on her skirt, the tiny fingers of her daughter, Ruth. The little girl's face, usually round like a biscuit, was hollowed out, sunken. Children believe their mothers are invincible, that they can fix anything, carry them anywhere. Clara let her believe it. Her shawl, once the bright blue of a Sunday morning sky, was now stiff with sweat and salt. She draped it over Ruth's shoulders every time the little girl stumbled, and she'd whisper the only spell she had left. "Shade soon, water soon. I won't let you go." It wasn't a promise anymore. It was a prayer, worn thin and patched over, but it was enough to keep Ruth's small feet moving for 1 more mile. Then another. Overhead, buzzards drew lazy circles in the sky. They were patient. They knew how this story usually ended. Ruth looked up, her voice a dry rasp. "Are the birds watching us, Mama?" "Just passing," Clara whispered back. But the lie was heavier than the child on her back. It was heavier than the sun. 2 days ago, the town had spit them out, just like a rotten seed. She'd walked down its main street, past the glint of glass windows and the hard eyes of men leaning in doorways. Their bellies were full. Their courage was cheap. All she had asked for was water. Laughter was the first thing they gave her, a sharp, ugly sound that rattled against her ribs. A peddler looked at her with something like pity, but his hands stayed deep in his pockets. Then came the sheriff. His boots were polished. His face was hard. He told her to keep moving. This wasn't a place for strays, he said. He didn't even look at Ruth. It's always easier when you don't look at the child. Clara kept her chin high until the town was just a smudge on the horizon. From a distance, pride can look a lot like dignity. Up close, under a sun that wants you dead, it just looks like thirst. She tried not to think about the man who'd promised them everything. A home. A family. He'd vanished the second those words got too heavy to carry. Charm is cheap out here. A man's word is worth less than the dust on his boots. His absence was a hole in her daughter's eyes, an echo that only got louder in the silence. The memory of his voice promising to send for them was a mirage, cruel and shimmering and utterly false. Clara squeezed Ruth's hand and forced herself to take another step. By late afternoon, the shadows got long but brought no relief. The heat was baked right into the ground. Clara lifted Ruth into her arms, her muscles screaming, and a cold terror washed over her. Her daughter felt light, too light. It's a kind of lightness no mother ever wants to feel. Her foot caught in a rut and she went down hard, her palms smacking the baked earth. Ruth didn't even cry. The tears had all dried up. Clara pressed her forehead to the ground, counting her own ragged breaths until the world stopped spinning. Then she pushed herself up and staggered on. That's when she saw it. A single crooked mesquite tree, like an old finger pointing at the sky. Its patch of shade was small, pathetic, really, but it looked like salvation. They stumbled toward it, and Clara slid down the trunk, pulling Ruth onto her chest. Even in the shade, the ground was a furnace. The sky began to bleed from copper into rose, a beautiful, cruel sunset made for front porches and sweet tea, not for a woman and a child who were being erased by the horizon. And then she heard it, a sound far out on the flats, hoofbeats, slow, even, the rhythm of someone who isn't in a hurry, the rhythm of someone who owns the ground they ride on. Clara's whole body went rigid. Out here, on this road, help and harm looked exactly the same. She pulled the stiff shawl tighter around Ruth, her eyes locked on the shimmering line where the earth met the sky. A plume of dust rose behind the rider, turned to gold by the last rays of the dying sun. "Is help coming?" Ruth rasped against her collarbone. "Rest," Clara said, kissing the top of her daughter's hot head. It was the only thing she could give her. The hoofbeats got louder, closer, pressing in on the silence until the silence itself changed shape. It was no longer empty. It was filled with a question. Clara leaned her head back against the rough bark and waited. This was it, the moment where a life swings one way or the other. Ruin or mercy, a stranger or a savior. Another door slammed shut, or one finally pushed open. The rider came into view, a dark shape against the blazing orange of the sunset. He was tall in the saddle, his posture easy but alert. His horse moved with a certainty that said it knew this land, had made its peace with the cruelty of it. He didn't wave, he didn't call out. He just reined in his horse a respectful distance away and looked at them. A woman in rags, a child too weak to lift her head, a scrap of shade borrowed from a dying tree. Clara's mouth formed the words, but no sound came out. "Keep riding. We're fine." But then Ruth whimpered, a tiny, broken sound that shattered the last of Clara's pride. The man swung down from his horse. The movement was slow, deliberate. Leather creaked. Dust puffed up from his boots. He crouched down, pulled a canteen from his saddle, and held it out. He didn't make a speech. He didn't ask questions. He didn't have the stink of pity on him. "Water," he said. His voice was low and even, like the land itself. Clara met his gaze for a long moment, searching for the trap. She found nothing. Just stillness. She took the canteen and pressed it to Ruth's lips. The little girl drank, coughing at first, then gulping it down. When Ruth's breathing finally steadied, Clara allowed herself a single shallow swallow. It tasted like forgiveness. The man, Thomas, she would later learn, didn't smile. He just stayed there, a steady, solid presence in a world that had become thin and brittle. In that small patch of shade, as the sky cooled from copper to violet, the story began to turn. Or so she thought, because as he helped her and her daughter onto his horse, his hand brushing against the small of her back, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Tattooed on the inside of his wrist, half hidden by his sleeve, was a small, coiled snake. The exact same tattoo the man who had abandoned her and Ruth had on his wrist. Thomas moved with a quiet certainty, lifting Ruth as if she were made of spun glass. The child, limp and frail, seemed to weigh nothing in his big arms, but he held her with a reverence that made Clara's throat tighten. This stranger wasn't holding a burden. He was holding something precious. Then his hand reached for her, calloused, weathered, steady. When her palm met his, she felt the solid strength of a man who knew hardship. But her eyes were locked on his wrist, on the faint outline of that snake tattoo peeking from under his cuff. Her mind screamed. It couldn't be. Not him. Not here. Was this some cruel trick of the universe? Had she run from one monster only to be found by his brother? His kin. He helped her into the saddle, settling Ruth in front of her, before swinging up behind them. His body was a solid wall at her back. Too close. She sat rigid, every muscle tensed. The horse moved forward, the steady rhythm of its hooves carrying them away from the lonely mesquite tree and into the deepening dusk. The sky burned with its final colors, but Clara didn't see it. All she saw was that snake, a symbol of a promise broken, of a life destroyed. The rhythm of the hooves wasn't safety. It was a countdown. What kind of trap had she just walked into? He led them toward a small cluster of cottonwoods by a shallow creek. He dismounted, lifted Ruth down, and laid her on a blanket from his saddle roll. Clara slid down, her legs shaking, but she kept her distance. Thomas didn't seem to notice. He tended to his horse, his movements deliberate, giving her space. It was the most terrifying courtesy she'd ever known. He built a small fire. The flames licked at the darkness, casting long, dancing shadows. He handed her a piece of dry bread from his pack. Ruth ate it slowly, her eyes heavy-lidded. Clara forced herself to take a bite, but it tasted like ash in her mouth. He sat across the fire from her, his face hidden in the shadow of his hat brim. He didn't speak. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. Her voice was a raw whisper. "Who are you?" He looked up. The firelight caught in his eyes. He seemed to consider the question, or maybe he was considering her, weighing the fear he had to see in her face. "Name's Thomas," he said, his voice even. She swallowed hard. "That snake on your wrist. I knew a man with a tattoo like that." A flicker of something crossed his face. Surprise? Recognition? He didn't deny it. He just looked down at his own hand, turning it over in the firelight. "A lot of men passed through the territories," he said, his voice flat. "A lot of men left their mark." It wasn't an answer. It was a wall. He was hiding something. She was sure of it. Clara pulled Ruth closer, her mind racing. The man who had left them was named Jed. He was charming and quick with a smile, the exact opposite of this quiet, stoic man. But brothers could be different. Or maybe they were part of the same gang, the same cruel brotherhood marked by a serpent. She looked at this man, Thomas, and saw the kindness in the way he handled her daughter. But she also saw the snake. And out here you always trust the snake. She closed her eyes, pretending to sleep, but her mind was a whirlwind. She had escaped the desert, but she had a terrible feeling she had just walked into a cage, a much more dangerous one. The next morning they rode to his ranch. It wasn't a grand place, just a simple, whitewashed house that looked like it had been fighting the wind and sun for years and was still standing. A red barn leaned a little, but its bones were good. There was a quiet dignity to it, a sense of endurance. It mirrored the man perfectly. He didn't welcome them with words. He just opened the barn door and pointed to a clean stall filled with fresh hay. "She can rest here," he said, meaning Ruth. He set down a tin plate with biscuits and jerky, then walked away without another word. It wasn't an invitation. It was a statement. "You are here. For now." In that quiet space, Ruth started to come back to life. A few sips of milk from a goat Thomas kept, a few bites of soft bread, and the color started to return to her cheeks. Soon her laughter, thin at first, was threading its way through the dusty air of the barn as she chased a kitten. Clara watched, her heart a tangled knot of gratitude and suspicion. Every move Thomas made was a contradiction. One evening he sat on the porch, carefully stitching a torn seam on one of Ruth's tiny shoes. He worked with a quiet focus, his big, rough hands surprisingly gentle. When Clara thanked him, her voice tight, he just nodded and kept stitching. But later that night she saw him by the corral, talking to two rough-looking men who had ridden in after dark. Their voices were low, urgent. She couldn't make out the words, but she saw one of the men gesture back the way they'd come, back toward the town that had cast her out. She saw Thomas shake his head, his posture rigid. Then she saw him pass a small, heavy-looking pouch to one of the men before they mounted up and rode off into the night. Bounty hunters, old partners in crime. She didn't know which was worse. Pride and fear warred inside her. She started working from sunup to sundown, hauling water, scrubbing floors, mending his torn shirts. She had to earn her keep. She had to prove she wasn't a burden, wasn't helpless. She had to make herself useful so that whatever he was planning, he might hesitate. Thomas never told her to stop. He just watched. Sometimes she'd catch his gaze from across the yard, his eyes unreadable. He wasn't judging her. He was measuring her. weighing her. But for what? The ranch was a fragile bubble of safety, but she knew it was about to pop. She had to find out who he was. She had to know what she was up against. One afternoon, while he was out mending a fence line on the far side of the property, she took her chance. Her heart hammering against her ribs, she slipped into the main house. It was sparse, clean, and fiercely masculine. A rifle was mounted over the fireplace. A pair of worn boots stood by the door. There was a single locked door at the end of the short hallway. Her hands trembled as she tested the knob. Locked tight, of course it was. Whatever secrets he was hiding were behind that door. She ran her fingers over the wood, feeling for a key, a loose board. Anything. Nothing. Defeated, she turned to leave, but as she passed the small table by his bed, she saw it. A small, leather-bound book, like a journal. His journal. She knew she shouldn't. It was a violation. But her own daughter's life could be at stake. Her hands shaking, she opened it. The handwriting was neat, precise. The entries were short, simple observations about the weather, the cattle, the price of feed. Nothing personal, nothing revealing. She flipped through the pages, her hope dwindling. Then she found it. An entry from about a year ago. Jed came by today, asked for money again, said he was heading east to make his fortune, said he'd met a woman. I told him not to make promises he couldn't keep. He never listens. The breath left her body in a rush. Jed. Her Jed. He knew him. They were brothers. She slammed the book shut just as she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching the house. Thomas was back. She shoved the journal back where she found it and fled back to the barn, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. So he knew. He knew all along who she was. He knew his own brother had left her and his child to die in the desert. And he had said nothing. This wasn't kindness. This wasn't mercy. This was something else. Something colder. Something calculated. He was his brother's keeper. And she and Ruth were a loose end. A problem he had to manage. The quiet ranch no longer felt safe. It felt like a trap, and the walls were closing in. The next time she went into town for supplies, the whispers were waiting for her. They followed her down the dusty street like a pack of stray dogs. Women at the mercantile shop stopped talking when she walked in, their eyes sharp and judgmental. "That's her," a woman by the fabric bolts muttered. "The one living out at the cursed ranch." Cursed? Clara's blood ran cold. Another woman chimed in, her voice dripping with venom. Living in sin with that man, after what happened to his first family. His first family? A preacher blocked her path on the steps outside, his eyes dark with pious fury. He spoke of shame, of temptation, of the devil finding footholds in lonely places. Every word was a stone thrown at her. She kept her head down, clutching Ruth's hand, and hurried back to the wagon. But the words followed her. Cursed ranch, his first family. It was all connected. The locked room, the secret meetings, the lies. That evening, the sunset was a bloody smear across the sky. Ruth was chasing fireflies, her innocent laughter a stark contrast to the darkness coiling in Clara's gut. She found Thomas by the barn, sharpening an axe, the rhythmic scrape of stone against steel setting her teeth on edge. She confronted him, her voice shaking but firm. "They call your ranch cursed," she said. "They talk about your first family. Your brother, Jed. He's my Ruth's father. You knew that, didn't you?" He stopped sharpening the axe. He set it down carefully and turned to face her. The last of the light cast his face in shadow, but she could see the weariness in his eyes. "Yes," he said, his voice low. "I knew. And you said nothing? You let me stay here, fearing you, fearing him." "I didn't want to cause you more pain," he said. "Pain?" she shot back, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "What do you think this is? This lie?" He took a step closer. "It's not a lie. Jed is my brother. My younger brother. He's always been reckless. He makes messes, and I try to clean them up." His gaze was unwavering. "When he wrote to me, told me he'd left a woman and child, told me where, I rode out to find you. I had to." The confession hung in the air between them. He hadn't stumbled upon them by accident. He had come looking for them. He had been cleaning up his brother's mess. She wasn't a person to him. She was an obligation, a problem to be solved. "And your first family?" she pressed, the words from town still stinging. "What happened to them?" His face closed off. The stillness returned, colder than before. "That's my business." He turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the falling darkness with the truth, which was somehow worse than any of her fears. She wasn't a guest. She was a burden he had inherited, and he had secrets he was still keeping. Secrets locked behind a door, secrets buried in the past. She knew then that she had to leave. She couldn't be his charity case, his brother's shameful secret. She'd rather face the desert again than live under the weight of his pity. But that night, the choice was taken from her. Ruth started coughing, a dry, hacking sound that quickly turned into a fever. Her small body burned with a heat that terrified Clara. Her breaths came in ragged, shallow gasps. It happened so fast. One minute she was chasing fireflies. The next, she was limp in Clara's arms, her eyes glassy and unfocused. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Clara by the throat. She pressed cool cloths to her daughter's forehead, but the fire inside just raged hotter. Memories of other losses, of other graves, clawed at her mind. Thomas was a steady shadow in the chaos. He moved through the small house with a grim purpose, fetching water, splitting more wood for the fire, his face a mask of concentration. He didn't offer empty words of comfort. He just worked. When Ruth started to shiver violently, Thomas took off his own heavy coat and wrapped it around her tiny, trembling frame. He knelt by the bed, his big hand resting gently on Ruth's chest, as if he could will his own strength into her. Hours bled into one another. Outside, a storm rolled in, the thunder rattling the window panes like an angry fist. But the real storm was inside, in the suffocating quiet of the sick room. Clara's hands started to shake so badly she couldn't hold the cup of water steady. Thomas's hand closed over hers, his grip firm, grounding her. "I've got it," he murmured. He held the cup to Ruth's lips, his touch impossibly gentle. He pulled a chair to the bedside and sat, his hat tipped low over his eyes. He didn't move for the rest of the night. He just watched. He just stayed. His silence wasn't empty. It was a shield holding back the despair that was trying to creep into the room. Clara watched him, her suspicion fighting a desperate, rising tide of something else. He wasn't acting like a man fulfilling an obligation. He was acting like a man who understood this particular kind of terror, who had sat in this same chair before. Just before dawn, the fever broke. The heat receded, leaving Ruth pale and slick with sweat, but her breathing was finally deep and even. She was asleep. Truly asleep. Thomas, drained and exhausted, had finally slumped over in the chair, his head on his chest. Relief, so powerful it was painful, washed over Clara. She stood up, her own body trembling, and stepped out onto the porch. The air was cool and clean after the rain. The sky was blushing with the first light of a new day. And it was there, in the quiet dawn, that she finally broke. Sobs tore through her, not of grief, but of a shattering, terrifying gratitude. She wasn't alone. Through the longest night of her life, he had not left her side. But as she looked out over the wet, glistening land, she saw it. Just past the corral, half hidden by a cluster of wildflowers the rain had brought to life, were two small, weathered wooden crosses. The graves of his first family. A wife and a child. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't just his house. It was a house of ghosts. He hadn't been watching over her and Ruth out of pity or duty. He was reliving a nightmare. The two small graves were a constant, silent presence on the ranch. Clara found herself looking at them from the kitchen window, from the porch, from the barn. They weren't morbid, they were just sad. A quiet testament to a life that had been violently interrupted. The fever had broken, but the ordeal had changed something between them. The silence was different now. It was filled not with suspicion, but with a shared, unspoken grief. She now understood the source of his kindness and the depth of his pain, but understanding didn't make it easier. In fact, it made it harder. She was living in a dead woman's house, raising her child in the shadow of his lost one. The thought was a constant, sharp ache in her chest. One morning, she found the courage to ask. She found him by the graves, running his hand over the weathered wood of the smaller cross. "What were their names?" she asked softly. He didn't seem startled. He just kept his back to her. "Anna," he said, his voice thick. "And my boy, Daniel." What happened? He was silent for a long time. The only sound was the wind rustling the dry grass. "The same fever," he finally said, his voice rough. "It came on fast. There was nothing the doctor could do. I lost them both in 2 days." He turned to look at her then, and for the first time she saw the full extent of the sorrow in his eyes. It was a vast, empty landscape, just like the one she had almost died in. The town. "They whispered," he continued. "They said the land was cursed. That I was cursed. It was easier than admitting a fever could just take people. Easier than admitting it could happen to them. So that was it. The town hadn't shunned him because he was dangerous. They had shunned him because he was a reminder of their own fragility. His grief was a disease they were afraid of catching. Watching you with Ruth," he trailed off, shaking his head. "I couldn't go through that again. I couldn't let it happen." All the pieces clicked into place. His frantic energy when Ruth got sick, the way he stayed by her bedside. He wasn't just saving her child, he was trying to save his own. He was fighting the ghost of a battle he had already lost. The weight of it was suffocating. She couldn't stay, she couldn't be a constant, living reminder of his dead wife and son. It was too cruel. She spent the next few days preparing, gathering the few things she had. She mended her dress, saved scraps of food. She would wait for the next supply wagon that passed on the main road and beg for a ride, anywhere. The morning she planned to leave, she woke before dawn. She dressed Ruth in the dark, whispering that they were going on an adventure. She scribbled a hasty note of thanks for Thomas, her hands shaking. She was halfway to the main road with Ruth on her hip when she heard the horse behind her. It was Thomas. He didn't look angry. He just looked tired. "Where are you going, Clara?" "I can't stay here," she said, her voice breaking. "I can't be her ghost." "Her name was Anna," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "And you are nothing like her. She was soft. She hated this land. You're a fighter. You're made of the same sun and dust that tried to kill you." He dismounted and walked toward her. "When I lost them, this ranch became a grave. For 3 years, I've just been the caretaker. But since you and Ruth came, it's starting to feel like a home again. The silence isn't so loud." He stopped in front of her. "Don't go," he said, and it wasn't a command. It was a plea. "Please, don't leave me with these ghosts all by myself." Tears streamed down her face. All this time she thought she was the one being saved, but maybe, just maybe, she was the one doing the saving. She looked at this strong, broken man. And then she looked at her daughter, who was staring up at Thomas with wide, trusting eyes. She had a choice. Walk away, back into the uncertainty and the cruelty of the world, or stay and build something new on the foundations of grief and loss. It was the scariest choice she had ever had to make. She took a deep breath, the clean morning air filling her lungs. "Okay, Thomas," she whispered. "We'll stay." They went back to the ranch, but everything was different. The decision to stay hadn't solved the problem. It had just changed its shape. Clara was no longer a temporary guest, but she wasn't family either. They were two lonely people, and one small child living in a house haunted by memories. The locked door at the end of the hall remained locked. Clara knew now that it must have been Anna and Daniel's room. A shrine he couldn't bear to look at, but couldn't bear to dismantle either. She respected his silence, but the door was a constant reminder of the woman she could never be, the son Ruth could never replace. One day, a circuit judge was passing through the nearest town, and Thomas announced he had to ride in on business. He was gone for 2 days. The ranch felt unnervingly quiet without him. It was during that time that Clara realized the truth. She didn't just feel gratitude for Thomas. Her feelings ran deeper, and that terrified her. How could she love a man who was still in love with a ghost? When he returned, he seemed different, quieter, more distant. He avoided her eyes. She was sure he had decided it was a mistake, that having them there was too painful. She started to pack her things again, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. That evening he found her in the barn, folding her worn shawl. "I saw my brother," he said without preamble. Clara froze. "Jed? He was in town, in jail, drunk and disorderly." Thomas's voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "He asked about you. I told him you and the girl were safe. He seemed relieved, said he was glad you'd found a better man." The words were like a slap. A better man. As if she had just traded one brother for another. "He signed a paper," Thomas continued, pulling a folded document from his pocket, "relinquishing any claim he has to Ruth. Legally. She's free of him." He handed her the paper. Her name was on it. Ruth's name was on it. And Jed's messy signature was at the bottom, witnessed by the judge. It was a severance, an ending, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a transaction. "So now the books are balanced," she said, her voice bitter. "The last piece of your brother's mess is all cleaned up." "Clara, that's not—" "Isn't it?" she interrupted, her control finally snapping. "You found us, you fed us, you healed us, and now you've legally untangled us from your family's shame. Your duty is done. We can be on our way." "I don't want you to go." His voice was suddenly loud, echoing in the quiet barn. It was the first time she had ever heard him raise it. "Why?" she cried. "So I can be a living, breathing reminder of everything you've lost? So you can look at my daughter and see the son who was taken from you? I can't live like that, Thomas, and I won't let Ruth live like that." He stared at her, his face pale in the lantern light. He looked from her to the main house, his jaw tight. Then, without another word, he turned and strode toward it. She watched him go, her heart sinking. She had pushed too hard. She had broken the fragile peace between them. A moment later, she heard a sound from the house, the sharp, splintering crack of wood. She ran out of the barn and saw him standing on the porch. In his hand was the axe from the woodshed. The locked door at the end of the hall was in pieces at his feet. He had broken it open. He stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, then turned to look at her. His eyes were filled with a terrible, raw pain. "The ghosts are only there if we let them be," he said, his voice raspy. "Help me clear them out." He held out his hand to her. It was an invitation to not just live in his house, but to share his life, to build a new one, together, right on top of the ashes of the old one. Taking his hand, she walked with him into the dark, dusty room. The room was just as she had imagined, a time capsule of a life that had ended 3 years ago. A small rocking horse stood in the corner, covered in a fine layer of dust. A woman's shawl was draped over a chair. A child's drawings were pinned to the wall. For a moment, Clara felt like an intruder, a grave robber. But then she looked at Thomas. His face was a mask of grief, but his eyes were resolute. This wasn't a desecration. It was a liberation. They worked together in silence, their movements careful, respectful. She packed Anna's dresses into a trunk. He took down the child's drawings, his fingers lingering on the faded crayon marks. They didn't throw anything away. They simply packed it up, acknowledging the past without letting it own the present. They moved the trunk and the rocking horse to the attic. When they were done, the room was empty. Just 4 bare walls and a window looking out onto the plains. It wasn't a shrine anymore. It was just a room, waiting for a new life. That night they sat on the porch, the silence comfortable for the first time. The stars were scattered across the sky like spilled diamonds. "My brother is heading west," Thomas said quietly, "on a prison wagon. He won't be back." "I'm sorry," she said, and she meant it. "Don't be," he replied. "Some people are just tumbleweeds. They're not meant to put down roots." He turned to her, his expression serious. "But I am. This land is in my bones. And this house, it's been empty for too long." He took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "I'm not asking you to replace her, Clara. No one ever could. I'm asking you to build something new with me. For you, for me, for Ruth." His voice dropped to a near whisper. "Marry me." The question hung in the vast, starry silence. It wasn't a question born of passion or romance. It was quieter, stronger. It was a question born of shared survival, of mutual respect, of 2 broken people realizing they might be whole enough to fix each other. Tears welled in her eyes, but for the first time they weren't tears of sorrow or fear. They were tears of hope. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes." The wedding wasn't a grand affair. The circuit preacher came back through, a tired man with kind eyes. A grizzled old ranch hand and his sharp-eyed wife stood as their witnesses. Clara wore a simple dress that Thomas had bought for her in town. He hadn't said a word, just left the package on her bed. The gesture spoke louder than any poem. He saw her not as a stray he'd rescued, but as a bride. Ruth, wearing a crown of wildflowers, acted as the flower girl, squealing with delight when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife. Thomas didn't give her a flashy ring. Instead, he slipped a simple, smooth wooden band onto her finger, one he had carved himself from the wood of a cottonwood tree by the creek. It was a promise, not of wealth, but of permanence, of roots. Life on the ranch settled into a new rhythm. It wasn't easy. The land was still hard, the winters were still brutal, and the whispers from town didn't disappear overnight. But they no longer mattered. Clara was no longer the widow living in sin. She was Mrs. Thomas, the rancher's wife, and the title was a shield. They turned the empty room into a room for Ruth, painting the walls a cheerful yellow. Her laughter filled the house, chasing out the last of the shadows. Thomas taught Clara how to read the land, how to predict the weather by the color of the sky. She taught him how to laugh again, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to surprise even him. They were not a fairy tale. They were 2 survivors who had found a harbor in each other. Their love wasn't a blazing fire. It was a steady, warm hearth that kept the cold at bay. It was built on the hard ground of truth, tempered by loss, and sealed with the quiet certainty of endurance. One evening, years later, they stood on the porch, watching the sun set. Ruth, now a young girl with her mother's resilience and Thomas's steady eyes, was down by the creek, skipping stones. The 2 small graves were still there, but they were no longer a source of pain. They were just part of the story, a reminder of the journey that had brought them all here. Clara leaned her head against Thomas's shoulder. "You were there," she said softly, "when the world would have let us die." He wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. His reply was quiet, but it held the weight of a mountain, the promise of 1,000 tomorrows. And I'll still be here. They had faced the worst the world could throw at them, the cruelty of man and the indifference of nature, and they had built a life, not in spite of the scars, but because of them. It just goes to show you that sometimes the deepest loves aren't found in sunshine and roses. They're forged in the desert, under a merciless sun, when one person stops and offers another a drink of water. If you enjoyed this story and you believe in second chances, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of survival and the strange ways fate works. Let me know in the comments what you think Clara's hardest choice was. Thanks for listening.